And welcome back to Neuropsychology. So far we have covered a lot. We have covered all these things. And in the last video we talked about the autonomic nervous system and the brainstem and all its anatomical features. So today we are going to talk about the forebrain, which is this entire thing. So of the three structures that make up the forebrain, two are subcortical. So these structures are under the cortex and are located more medially in the brain. These subcortical structures are the basal ganglia and the limbic system. And then in the future, or in the following video, we are going to talk about the cerebral cortex, which is the outside layers of the cerebrum. So these three regions share many connections, and then those connections will form functional circuits. Okay, so let's start off with the basal ganglia. So basal ganglia in Latin technically means lower nodes. So the basal ganglia are a collection of nuclei, and they form a circuit with the outside cortex. The basal ganglia, again, are subcortical structures, which means they are located under the cortex. So the basal ganglia consist of the caudate nucleus, which you can see right here in a purple color. And it has the putamen, which is right here, the outside layer of this beautiful triangle. Putamen is Latin for shell. And then we have the globus pallidus, which are these two little parts. Okay, so I know there's a lot of things in here. We talked about a bunch of things briefly before, but let's go over them right now. So the thalamus, we're going to go over that in the end of this chapter, which is this round circular shape right here. The corpus callosum is a commissure right here, which connects the two hemispheres. Here we have the lateral ventricle, which we have already covered, but now you can see it in a coronal slice. Here you have the subthalamic nuclei, and also on both hemispheres, and then we have the substantia nigra right here, which we also talked about because the substantia nigra is also in the brainstem. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these structures. So the caudate nucleus receives projections from all the areas in the cortex, and then it sends its own projections through the putamen and the globus pallidus to the thalamus, and then from there it goes towards the frontal areas of the cortex, so the frontal lobe areas. The basal ganglia also have reciprocal connections with the midbrain, especially with the substantia nigra, which we covered in the previous video, which is located in the midbrain tegmentum. So the basal ganglia are very important for learning and also for movement. So what I want you to see is that the globus pallidus here has two little parts. So you have one on the inside, internal, and one on the outside, which is external. So we call this globus pallidus internus and globus pallidus externus. So you can also say GPI is the middle one for globus pallidus internal, and GPE is the outside one for globus pallidus externus. Okay, diseases of the basal ganglia. So whenever the basal ganglia is damaged, the characteristics of these diseases are either a loss of movement or too much movement. So you have exaggerated movement. But it always has to do with movement. So when you have damage to the basal ganglia, you do not have issues with the production of movement, but you will have issues with controlling your movement. So there are two diseases with excessive movement, and those are Huntington Disease and Tourettes Syndrome. And then we have a disease with a loss of movement, and this is Parkinson's disease. You guys probably heard these terms before, but let's briefly go over these three diseases. Okay, so in Huntington's disease, the cells in the basal ganglia progressively die off. And as these cells and as these cells die, involuntary body movements start occurring. So movements in Huntington's disease are kind of like dance-like movements, and that's why they are called chorea, which means dance in Latin. The onset of the disease is about 40 years. So as you can see in the picture right here, so due to tissue loss of the basal ganglia, the lateral ventricles will increase in size, kind of to make up for all this lost space. And then psychological problems will also include dementia, personality changes, and depression. So I put a link here to a video for more information if you wanted to go check that out. Another disease that has to do with the basal ganglia is Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is characterized by difficulty initiating movement and also by muscular rigidity. So someone with Parkinson's disease might have difficulties getting up out of a chair or initiating certain movements. Alongside those difficulties with initiating movement or muscular rigidity, patients may also display rhythmic tremors, for example, of their hands or of their legs. So whenever they want their legs or hands to be still, they might be showing a little tremor or actually a big tremor in those limbs. So in Parkinson's disease, there's often a loss of connection in and out of the basal ganglia. So a really big characteristic is often that the connection with the substantia nigra of the midbrain has decreased. So there's a loss of connection between those structures. Okay, in Tourettes Syndrome, a person often has involuntary tics, especially to the face and the head. So the cause of Tourette's syndrome is unknown. People are still researching this, but it definitely has to do with the basal ganglia. So another characteristic of Tourette's syndrome is having involuntary vocalizations. So examples of these are when people say curse words or when they start making animal sounds. And again, this disease is associated with a decrease or cell death in the basal ganglia. So in Tourette's syndrome, you have excessive movement. Okay, so far we have covered the basal ganglia, and now we are going to switch to the limbic system. So the limbic system plays a big role in behaviors such as emotion. It's very important for learning and memory, also for spatial behavior and navigation, and for social behaviors. So the parts of the limbic system are the amygdala, as you can see right here. See the hippocampus here in blue. You have the septum and the cingulate cortex. Okay, so the amygdala, as you can see right here, the amygdala means almond in Latin. And the amygdala contains nuclei in the base of the temporal lobe. And the amygdala is really important for emotion and emotion regulation. Next up we have the hippocampus right here. The hippocampus, it means seahorse in Latin. So if you rip out a human hippocampus, as you can see right here, it looks exactly like a cute little seahorse. So the hippocampus is a structure and is located in the anterior medial region of the temporal lobe. And it's also really important for memory and for spatial navigation. Then we have the cingulate cortex. The cingulate cortex is right here. And this is a 3-layered strip that is right above the structure that connects the two hemispheres, which is the corpus callosum. So I remember I talked about that a couple slides back, very briefly. The cingulate cortex is really important for sexual behavior and also for reward, decision making, and other social interactions. And then we have the septum, which is important for emotion and species typical behavior. So the limbic system has a role in self-regulatory behaviors such as emotional, memory, which includes navigation, motivation, reward. Oh, and I already said it, navigation. Okay, so the limbic lobe structures are more inward of the brain, so more medially. So they're under the cortex, so they're subcortical, and they kind of curve into the temporal lobe. So especially the hippocampus curves into the temporal lobe. And the amygdala is right in front of it, so you don't forget that. These two are right in front of each other. So the limbic lobe structures are in the midline. The hippocampus curves away into the temporal lobe, as you can see right here. And the limbic lobe terminates in the amygdala. Okay, this was the end of this video. I will see you guys back in the next video.